take us to 2031. Now, these inquiries, amongst the issues that's been raised with me, and if she's been speaking to victims, they'll have raised this with her, is that it's very hard for victims and survivors.
Well, there, I mean, when he was elected, right, saying, I'll smash the gangs, all he ultimately ended up doing was smashing the grands by actually taking away their winter fuel payments. That's all he's managed. 30,000 since he was elected.
Who were allowed for years to act with impunity due to political correctness. Douglas, we saw the rule of law, we saw common decency sacrificed in the name of community cohesion and cultural sensitivity. Has the UK now learnt its lesson? Could the grooming gang scandal happen again?
It was a moment no one saw coming. Parliament shook to its core as Labour MPs did the unthinkable. They turned on their own leader live on national television and demanded that Keir Starmer resign. What began as a calm debate spiralled into a political explosion. A party once seen as a symbol of justice was now imploding. Starmer's leadership was hanging by a thread. Protesters were in the streets, membership cards were being burned and public trust had collapsed. And it all started with one quiet MP, Katie Lamb, who decided to speak the truth.
In before a court, and if they're guilty, into prison. So that's my number one route. Of course, I accept the argument that there should be wider inquiries. There have been a number of inquiries. We've had hundreds of recommendations. We've had a national inquiry with 22 recommendations. My strong belief is we've got to implement those recommendations. At the moment, and under the last government, they just stacked up and sat on a shelf. So they need to be implemented. We're now implementing the recommendations from the national inquiry. 17 of them we're taking forward. Of course, if there's further local inquiries that are needed, then we put some funding behind that and they should happen.
She wasn't famous. She didn't enter the chamber seeking attention, but the moment she rose to speak, everything changed. Her tone was calm, her words devastating. Lamb tore open a wound that had been festering beneath the surface of British politics for years. The grooming gang scandals that left entire communities scarred and betrayed.
Over 3 months since the government announced these local inquiries, Tom Crowther KC, a barrister invited by the Home Office to help establish them, knows almost nothing about their progress, and neither do we. Why is the framework for local inquiries now being led by ministers rather than by independent voices such as Tom Crowther? Why is the £5 million set aside for inquiries no longer being allocated, but instead delivered on an opt-in basis? And what does the government intend to do about local leaders who say there is no need for an independent inquiry, like in Bradford or in Wales?
She didn't mince her words. The girls we are talking about, Mr. Speaker, are predominantly white. The men who preyed on them were predominantly Muslim, generally either from Pakistan or of Pakistani heritage. She quoted a victim who was told by her rapist, "We're here to feff all the white girls and the government." Her voice didn't shake. She stared directly into the eyes of her party and demanded answers. With surgical precision, Lamb exposed what others had long feared to say. Rotherham, Telford, Oxford. Names that should have sparked outrage and reform, but instead became footnotes in political silence. She told the story of Anna from Bradford, raped at 14, married to her abuser at 15 in a traditional Islamic ceremony, while her social worker attended as a guest.
Mr. Speaker, she raised a question of a victim with me, and quite right to, and I accept that victims and survivors are in different places on this. Those that I've spoken to are worried about the delay of a further inquiry. The last inquiry took 7 years. That would take us to 2031. Now, these inquiries, amongst the issues that's been raised with me, and if she's been speaking to victims, they'll have raised this with her, is that it's very hard for victims and survivors to come forward to explain what's happened.
And then she turned directly to Keir Starmer. She detailed how one of the rape gang ringleaders had been employed by the council. As a welfare rights officer, even after his arrest, the community centre he worked at wasn't informed. Lamb didn't deliver a political speech. she delivered a reckoning.
In January, you promised 5 local inquiries into the rape gangs scandal in this country. I'm sure you agree it's one of the most horrific crimes committed against children in this country. But then we get this announcement from Jess Phillips yesterday, 45 minutes before Easter recess began, it must be said, saying that following feedback, there's now going to be this flexible approach. There's now going to be locally led work on grooming gangs. Are you really allowing councils to mark their own homework? Are you abandoning the victim?
What followed was an eerie silence. Jess Phillips, usually the first to defend women's rights, sat just a few feet away, silent. No rebuttal, no comment, no attempt to deflect. The silence said more than words ever could. Then, out of nowhere, a Conservative MP stood up. Typically quiet this time, he didn't hold back. He praised Katie Lamb and turned his fury towards Starmer, calling him a political imbecile. He accused the Labour leader of ignoring child abuse cases and declared Keir Starmer must resign. The chamber erupted. Labour MPs shouted in outrage, others sat frozen. Some slammed their desks. One reportedly stormed out. The dam had broken and no one could pretend otherwise. But that was just the beginning. Outside the Commons, chaos spread like wildfire. Membership cards were burned live on streams. Party offices in Manchester and Sheffield reported hundreds of resignations within hours. Leaked emails from Labour HQ showed panic. One strategist wrote, "We need a sacrificial lamb, fast." Another questioned if Starmer could survive the week.
The abuse gang scandal, Elon Musk sharing a lot of reporting being done by GB News, exposing some of this scandal right across the country, and we revealed up to 50 different towns and cities involved in it. On the back of all that public pressure, the government on January the 16th announced, among several measures, they would push for 5 locally led inquiries, like the one we've seen in Telford or in Oldham or in Rotherham. Now, 3 months later, people have been waiting for an update on that. OK, we've kept reporting on the issue. We've not wanted it to fall out of the news agenda.
Meanwhile, Katie Lamb remained silent, refusing interviews, declining TV appearances. She didn't want attention. She wanted justice. And her silence spoke louder than any headline. But the firestorm was only getting hotter. Tom Crowther, KC, a barrister invited by the Home Office to help set up local inquiries into the grooming gangs, testified that he knew almost nothing about the inquiry's progress.
In the town told me yesterday that Tom Crowther, KC, the barrister appointed by the government to look into this, did meet them as they prepared to launch their inquiry. But there are also troubling questions for the government about his involvement. Among that raft of announcements made in January, Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, also said that Mr Crowther would be developing a framework independently of the government in order to launch those 5 local inquiries. He revealed last week in the Home Affairs Select Committee that he's not been involved whatsoever and that ministers are actually developing.
Despite a £5 million 0 pence fund being promised, it was no longer guaranteed. Instead, it would be allocated only if local councils opted in. Some, like Bradford, said no independent inquiry was needed at all.
Problem. It's no use us just trying to impose one solution from Whitehall. We know that there are repeated patterns over and over again about young girls not being believed because they're young, because they're female and because they're working class, and the warning signs and the warnings that when they raise their voices going unheard and unacted upon. We're absolutely determined to make sure that we give local areas the tools that they need to tackle the problems in their communities, and we will hold them to account for it. Of course we will. And
why were ministers now leading the framework, not independent voices like Tom Crowther? Why was the £5 million 0 pence once set aside for inquiries no longer being allocated automatically but handed out on an opt-in basis? And the biggest question of all, why, after everything, was this still being buried?
The £5 million funding announced in January is being made available to local authorities to help strengthen local responses to child sexual exploitation, and all local authorities will be able to apply for funding for their local inquiries or other work in this area. The Home Secretary has written to every local authority on our plans to support local inquiries, and after listening to local authorities about what they need, we made the decision to implement the fund in a flexible way. Some people have criticised that and said, well, that might mean that local authorities now have the decision about whether or not they want to investigate themselves, which, given some of the...
The silence wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. Survivors had waited years. Communities had waited longer. Promises had been made, and still the government shifted responsibility, deflected accountability, and delayed the truth. It didn't feel like a process, it felt like a cover-up, and people were no longer willing to stay quiet. By nightfall, online outrage was uncontainable. Survivor groups rallied in city squares. In Birmingham, Labour posters were ripped down and replaced with signs reading, "We want accountability." And then came the documents, a cache of Home Office files dating back to when Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions, revealed that some abuse cases were delayed or shelved altogether due to fears about community cohesion. Translation, they didn't want to upset voters. Starmer's name was directly mentioned in several memos. That was the breaking point. Jess Phillips cancelled her public events, reports swirled, she was being pressured to step down, her statement to the press was vague and only fueled the anger. Soon after, it was confirmed she and 2 senior Labour MPs were under formal investigation by the Parliamentary Ethics Committee. Civil cases were being drafted. Human rights lawyers were preparing. Some even whispered about possible criminal charges. The air was heavy with anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. Legal teams worked late into the night, poring over documents, collecting testimonies, building timelines.
Use of scrutiny, because all ministers need scrutiny on their policies, and clearly they were trying to dodge that. So well done to Katie Lamb MP for showing up for that. But the reality is even reading that Home Office spokesperson's statement, it's quite clear they're saying they're not doing local inquiries. They're saying local, as you said, locally funded support. That's not the same thing. And quite frankly, the 5 local inquiries weren't good enough in the first place. We needed a national inquiry. Now, that was already turned down. And this is shameless, Patrick. One day before recess, so they know they can't be held accountable. How utterly cowardly.
Imagine if this was the Tories. Imagine if this was the Tory party and Labour was able to beat them with this big stick about the fact that they were reluctant to investigate such a serious issue in this country, and they pulled this stunt. But even more, other than the whataboutery, what exactly do they expect people to do with this? Oh, we have a flexible fund, and if
Outside courtrooms, reporters gathered sensing a story that could shake the system. Officials began to avoid questions, phones rang unanswered. Silence thickened. Those at the centre of it all spoke in hushed tones, wary of being overheard. Every move, every file, every whisper hinted at something larger. The machinery of accountability had started to turn. Slowly, but unmistakably. Inside Labour HQ, emergency meetings devolved into shouting matches. MPs leaked minutes to the press. Angela Rayner reportedly contacted trade unions to explore a leadership challenge. But even she was tangled in scandals of her own. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, a whistleblower from the Crown Prosecution Service came forward. They confirmed that grooming cases had been deprioritised for fear of sparking ethnic tensions. Internal Labour memos showed the party knew confronting the scandal would be bad for optics in key voting areas. The outrage wasn't confined to Westminster. Protests spread across the country. Chants of "You let us down" echoed in towns like Rotherham and Telford. Labour's support in working class areas nosedived. Some polls showed drops of up to 30%.
Something they say going forward.
No, they're cowards, Patrick. They are cowards. This act should expose them for that. The fact that they'd done this the day before recess and they did it right before the end of play of Parliament shows you the intent. If they really wanted to be scrutinised on this massive, massive U-turn that they only had those inquiries in the first place to appease the public outrage, if they really wanted the scrutiny, they'd give Parliament the time to do it. They did not want the scrutiny. And the ministers should be held accountable for that.
2 questions here, Jonathan. Can we trust anything that Labour say going forward? And secondly, are there...
And then came the motion of no confidence filed by a cross-party group of MPs. It was the final nail. Keir Starmer, once seen as Labour's great hope, now faced political destruction. Judge Elena Blake, known for her fearless approach, was appointed to lead a newly expanded national inquiry. She was granted full authority, documents, witnesses, no limits. The public, survivors and activists watched closely. They had waited too long. In the final twist, survivor groups themselves sent a letter directly to Parliament. It read, "We've been silent too long. We were abandoned, but we will not be silent any longer." That sentence echoed through the halls of power. And Katie Lamb, the MP who started it all, still refused the spotlight. No interviews, no parading, no deals. In a world of spin and spectacle, she became something rare, a symbol of truth.
Investigating, if appropriate, prosecuting, and then getting people in before a court, and if they're guilty, into prison. So that's my number one route. Of course, I accept the argument that there should be wider inquiries. There have been a number of inquiries. We've had hundreds of recommendations. We've had a national inquiry with 22 recommendations. My strong belief is we've got to implement those recommendations. At the moment, and under the last government, they just stacked up and sat on a shelf. So they need to be implemented. We're now implementing the recommendations from the national inquiry. 17 of them we're taking forward. Of course, if there's further local inquiries that are needed, then we put some funding behind that and they should happen. But I don't think that simply saying we need more inquiries when we haven't even...
This was never just about Starmer. It wasn't even just about Labour. It was about an entire system that failed its children, a nation waking up to the cost of silence. The only question now, will justice finally be served? Or will this too become another scandal lost in the storm? The silence is deafening. The eyes of a nation watching promises were made, lines were crossed. The truth is out there, waiting. But will anyone be brave enough to act? Or is this the end of accountability? Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this political rollercoaster. If you found this as shocking as I did, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more. Politics moves fast. I'll help you keep up. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious and question everything.